So as we walk through the book of Jonah, we kind of saw in chapter 1 how God gave to Jonah a clear and unambiguous command. Go to Nineveh. And we saw Jonah respond with willful, blatant disobedience. And we saw God in his mercy pursue Jonah and directly pursue his life. And we saw all the chaos that Jonah's sin caused in the lives of the people that were around him. We saw the people that were in relationship with Jonah suffering unjustly because of Jonah's decision. We saw God reveal Jonah's sin, and we saw Jonah become increasingly and remain increasingly more and more stubborn. We saw God call Jonah and give him the same command in chapter 3, go to Nineveh, and he goes to Nineveh, and we saw the compassionate heart of God as as the people repented, God relented of his decision to destroy the nation. And we saw the compassion and mercy of God as God did not destroy the people of Nineveh. And then we saw, we kind of backtracked and went to the beginning of the book, and we kind of tracked through the entire book of Jonah to get to explore and uncover Jonah's anger and his expressions of anger. And that's what we dealt with last Sunday morning, how Jonah had a vision of what he wanted his world to be like, and how he insisted that others around conform to what he wanted his world to be. This morning we're going to kind of finish the book. We're going to kind of unpack the absolute, utter absurdity of where Jonah ultimately ends up. So Jonah has embraced this kind of anger in his heart, and he's allowed it to fester, and God has pursued it, but Jonah has remained kind of bitter. We saw his graceless message, and we saw his desire to see his reality created and his world be exactly the way he wanted it to be. And we're going to unpack, as we walk through chapter 4, we're going to unpack how absolutely, utterly ridiculous and absurd Jonah ultimately gets himself to be. And we're going to watch God unpack and expose Jonah's absurd attitude and his absurd heart. So Jonah chapter 4, verse number 1, we're going to start by saying that God has a heart that's full of compassion. Verse 1, and it displeased Jonah exceedingly. So this word exceedingly means, and we've talked about it a couple of times, but it means disproportionate to, or disproportionately. So Jonah is angry and disproportionately upset that God is not going to kill this nation. So it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. So Jonah is going to display this absolute ridiculous behavior. He is disproportionately angry because God won't kill these millions of people that Jonah wants killed. Now, let's take a break. So think about your kids when they were maybe 2.5, 3 years old, how cute they were sleeping. Do you remember going into their room and listening to the mini snore from the little mini child, when they're kind of like breathing heavy? And all of the rage of the day kind of goes away as you look at this precious life that is sleeping in some bizarre position with the covers randomly spread everywhere and one sock on and one sock off. You remember this part of your... You remember how you used to lean over and you would give them a kiss on their forehead or their cheek, and it was a hot kiss, like their faces were warm from resting in their bed. Y'all remember that, or am I the only sentimental human in the world? Okay. Like, get your mind around the idea of them thinking, die. Right? How absurd is that response? Like, no normal, no rational, no reasonable person could walk into, I mean, like if we walked into your house and I was not my child and I saw, it's just the cutest, most beautiful, or you watch these kids play before they start fighting. You watch them playing and they're having a great time and they're giggling and they're laughing, or you see these little 2-3-year-old kids and they got these little curly hair. Sometimes moms will dress their kids up for church, and they're just like for that little bit where they're, still sane, and they're just dressed up, and they're just the cutest thing in all the world. Like, how do you respond? Like, Jonah is angry. He is disproportionately upset because God's heart is full of compassion. And what we're unpacking and seeing is that the end result of Jonah's decisions, the end result is just foolishness. It's foolishness on an unexplainable level. And the interesting thing about Jonah, and we're going to see this as he makes an argument with God. The interesting thing about Jonah is he is so ridiculously out of line, but Jonah thinks he's right. And that's the end logic of a person who embraces like sinfulness as a pattern. Like eventually you get to the place where you actually, your words are ridiculously absurd, but you think you're right. I was at dinner with a friend of mine a number of years ago, and he's a guy in our church, and a nice guy, and his wife was ill, and she had advanced diabetes, and ultimately she lost her life, and kind of processed through that. And a short while later, I found out that he was dating again, which is fine. And so I went to kind of process that with him. His daughters were upset that he was dating, and so we kind of processed that with him, and I took him out for dinner, and we were having dinner together. I was talking about this girl that he was dating, and then after a little while, I just wanted to take my fork and stab him in his eyeball, because he's arguing with me, and I'm telling him, you cannot continue this relationship. You have to break up with this woman. What are you thinking? What are you doing? And now I know you're thinking, because I haven't given you enough of the story, why would I say that he had to break up with her? Because she was married. And I'm having this absurd conversation with this guy who is arguing with me the validity of, well, her husband isn't really that nice of a guy. They're planning on divorcing soon. But, right? How many want to stab him in the eye with a fork too? I mean, this is absurd. And this is the end of this anger that is festered in his heart. And this is the end of allowing this sinfulness to develop and grow. And we know what we're talking about. He wants these people to die. Verse 2. And he prayed, and he's gonna explain the basis of his anger. He's disproportionately angry, and he prayed to the Lord and said, "O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew," this is what he knows, "I knew that you were gracious." Now think about this. He's angry. Why is he angry? He's angry because he knew certain things about God. He is disproportionately, violently angry because God is gracious and merciful and slow to anger, abounding in a faithful, steadfast, enduring love, and relenting of disaster. A rational mind would find these qualities of God not accusations, but instead they would find them attributes. And he knew God well enough to know that he might, in fact, not destroy the people of Nineveh. And so when we get through chapter 2, what we find is that Jonah has ultimately got to the place where he thinks God is bad. He's ultimately got to the place where he thinks God is evil. That what God is doing, that God's nature and character, what it is, and instead of blessing Jonah that God is merciful and God is good and God is gracious and God is kind and God relents, instead of that blessing Jonah, Jonah finds that loathsome. Jonah has got to the place where he doesn't even like God anymore. That's how far down the journey he goes. Verse 3, and he says, "Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live." And then God asks a rhetorical question. And the Lord said to him, "Do you do well to be angry?" Or in other words, is this anger justified? Are you okay with this? Do you think you're right? You know, are you thinking clearly? And the implied answer, of course, is yes. And this is absurd. This is crazy talk. He is arguing that the good qualities of God have produced evil in his world, and he is exceedingly angry because God is good. And while we listen to Jonah and we think about what he's doing, we have also, I think, heard or maybe ourselves experienced some absurdity. I had a lady come to my office a few years ago, and she started out in an argument. Not a fight, but an argument. She's presenting her case. Her husband was not the man she thought he was when she married him. In fact, she had uncovered the fact that he was not perfect. He had presented himself as better, and she had uncovered the truth. He was deeply flawed. And he was deeply flawed. She, of course, not so flawed. And so she began this conversation, and I began doing what I do, which is ultimately say, are you going to be okay if your husband is still flawed? Are you going to pursue righteousness in the face of his sinfulness? Which is really all you can do, because you can't manage someone else's behavior without being manipulative, and then that's sinful, and so their sin becomes your sin in this crazy circle. And so I'm having this conversation with her, and she boils the whole thing down, and she says, "I'm not happy." To which my little ADD brain said, "I'm not happy right now either." But I did not say that out loud. She said, "I'm not happy. And God does not want us to go through life unhappy. And so I'm going to file. My friends have told me this is it." And I said, "On what basis?" I shouldn't tell you. She said, "On what basis?" She said, "Well, he's had an affair." I said, "What?" And she said, "Yeah, I caught him looking at a girl." And I thought, okay, I said, what was he looking at? She said, her eyes. And I said, what would you prefer him to look at? And she said, I just know. And I thought, you're crazy. Again, something I didn't say out loud. It's absurd. It's absurd. She's taken the rules and character and nature of God, and she's boiled it all down to, and now she's gonna act on that. I'm not happy in my marriage. God wants me happy, so I'm gonna change it. We've heard people say, if God didn't want me to be like this, he wouldn't have made me like this. And it's absurd. And it's an absurd statement that we judge God to be evil while we continue down a lifestyle. There are people in churches that come to church who have offenses and I have like the makings of a cold. I think it's just Houston. And it's like Houston air is just sitting in my bronchial tubes and won't leave. And not that I want all the air to leave, but whatever this is, I would like to go. It's been like 3 weeks. What do they call that? Allergies? Somebody, I don't know. What was I talking about? Good grief. Start coughing. Some people have spent years angry and broken and bitter over a real or perceived issue, and it's years, and they're still angry, and that's absurd. It's absurd that we would go through our lives not releasing the anger for. And I'm certain the responses to me are the yeah buts. Yeah, but you don't know, or yeah, but da-da-da. And it's absurd. It's absurd. Here's Jonah wishing he should die. And God says to him, is your anger justified? And Jonah says, be sure. Verse 5, Jonah went out of the city, and God is going to illustrate how absolutely ludicrous Jonah is. Jonah went out of the city and sat to the east of the city and made a booth for himself, kind of like a little lean-to there, and he sat under it in the shade till he should see what would become of the city. And so he goes out because he wants it to be destroyed, and he wants to watch it. And so now the Lord, and God does this thing for Jonah. He pointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be a shade over his head to save him from his discomfort. And so God causes this plant to grow, and how fast it grew, we don't know, but he causes this plant to grow that kind of covers his little lean-to that he made, and it makes his existence, looking over the city, waiting for it to be ruined, it makes his existence a little bit more bearable. In verse 6, so Jonah was exceedingly, again, he's disproportionately happy because of the plant. Like, he likes vegetables, so he's just weird. And he just loves his new plant that has shown up for him. Then God kind of tweaks him a little bit. But in verse 7, when dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the plant, and it died. Then God tweaks him a little more. Verse 8. When the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind. Ugh. And the sun beat down on the head of Jonah, so that he was faint. And he asked that he might die, and he said, it is better for me to die than to live. And then God asked Jonah again another rhetorical question. God said to Jonah, do you do well to be angry for the plant? Is your anger justified? Is it right that this has made you so upset? And Jonah said, "Yes, I do well to be angry, angry enough to die. I love the plant. The plant is gone. I am justified. It isn't wrong. I loved it. It was good. I would rather die than live. I love the plant." And God says, look, if you are justified, if you feel like you've done nothing wrong in loving the plant so much that when it's gone it grieves you so, how should I respond? Verse 10, the Lord said, "You pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in the night and perished in the night. And should not I pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 babies?" Persons who don't know their right hand from their left. He says, this is full of children. And I was just looking for an opportunity to have compassion on them because that's God, and God has a heart of compassion, and the door open for God to have compassion. And he's saying to Jonah, like if you are justified in your anger over a plant, how justified would I be in sparing millions of people? And then God throws in, favorite line of the book, God throws in like the pinnacle of his argument. Like if 120,000 babies doesn't convince you to have compassion on this city, he finishes his line and he says, "And also much cattle." There's lots of beef there. Like, he's so absurd, And I'm thinking Jonah be like, "Oh, the cows. Yeah." I mean, it's livestock. But, I mean, it's just, he's so ridiculously absurd that God tags this little line at the end. And he's like, if 120,000 babies, I don't know their left hand from the right, 120,000 toddlers, this city of multiple millions, if their lives don't compel you to have compassion, just think about all the goats and sheep and cows. Like, I can't let that happen. Jonah is just utterly absurd that he is going through this life so indifferent to the lives of the people that he had contact with, that God is just exposing how small Jonah really is. Like, Jonah's world had become so tiny that the only thing he cared about as a result of his bitterness and anger and sin was the minor conveniences of life, regardless of what happens around him. And God is like, you are absolutely, completely ludicrous. Now, we have this tendency. Like, Jonah's such an absurd character that we have this tendency to kind of walk away from him. But before we walk away completely, I want to talk about what would allow a man's world what would allow a man's world to be so small that he could not express compassion to these broken people? Then I personalize that. What would allow us to allow our worlds to be so small that we don't express compassion for other people? Ultimately, the greatest compassion is the sharing of the gospel. And in fact, sharing Christ models the compassionate heart of God. Like, what could happen that our world could get so tiny that we don't share the compassionate heart of God, the compassion of God to others. Like we look at Jonah and we think, Jonah, you're absurd. You have received all of this grace. You were in the belly of the fish. You were released from that. You've received that. You've seen God do this wonderful miracle, and now you're still wanting these people to die. You're actually upset because a plant grows and dies. Jonah, you are out of your mind. Your world is so tiny. The only thing you care about is yourself. There's this whole world out there that God is like, look, there's millions and cows. There's millions. Like what? Like we can't be like that, right? Like we cannot be like this. Like our worlds cannot become so small that we use the excuse of personality, or we use the excuse of pace of life, or we use the excuse of temperament, or we use the excuse of energy, that our worlds become so ridiculously small that the only way, we have no capacity to show and share the compassion that God has for lost people. Like we can't let that happen. Like we get up and go to work, and we interact with the same people, and we come home and we close our garage door and we watch television and we go to sleep, and then we get up and we go to work and we interact with the same people, and we come home, we close the garage door, we go to sleep, and then one of the days we go to church and we listen to the preacher, and then we go home and we close the garage door, and like that's the story of our life. Like our world has become so small that de facto we're just like Jonah. It's not like we're standing up and saying, God, kill all my neighbors, hopefully. Like, God, kill all my neighbors. But our indifference is essentially the same concept, right? Like, if we're not sharing Christ, if we're not loving them, if we're not modeling Christ for them, if we're not engaging them, then that indifference is basically the same thing. It's like we're sitting in our house being like, well, I wonder what's going to happen to them someday. They'll probably just die, and then who knows? It's like we're sitting on the side of the hill just watching. So that can't be our story, right? All right, you have to answer. That can't be our story, right? Like, we can't live lives like that. Like, as followers of Jesus, we cannot beauty in the grace of God and not share the grace of God. That has to be who we are. That has to be what we do. That has to be the story of our life. Okay.